We are going to move into a conversation that is coming as part of our series called SOCAP Next. And these are kind of the next level of conversations focused on action and focused on the how and the doing of the work. Some of these conversations will come following SOCAP Virtual, which we just had a couple of weeks ago here in October. This conversation in particular, I'm really excited for us to begin with. At SOCAP Virtual, we talked a lot about moving to a new form of capitalism and what that might look like and how might we do that. We unpacked that in many different ways, looking at stakeholder capitalism all the way into regenerative capitalism, multiple formats. One of the things that has really struck me about this conversation that I'm excited for us to host today is talking about the how have systems changed, but how do we start and where do we begin? And if we're not thinking about capitalism in different ways and how each of us can do that and then how that rolls out to the system, we will have a harder time getting started in this new format. And today, I am really looking forward to having Nathan Scolaro. He's the editor of Dumbo Feather. He's going to lead us in this conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Nathan, and then I will be here. We'll take questions toward the end, and really excited to be a part of the conversation. So thank you so much, Nathan, and over to you.
Thanks, Carrie. Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be part of this program and to have this hour together to explore multiple forms of wealth with Napoleon Mehta. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm calling in from. They are the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. And I want to extend this acknowledgement to the traditional owners of all the lands on which you're calling in from, and to acknowledge the incredible wisdom and custodianship that has been shown to these lands for many thousands of years. So as Carrie said, I'm Nathan, I'm the editor of Dumbo Feather. And for those of you who don't know, Dumbo Feather is a quarterly print magazine. We're based here in Melbourne in Australia. We're also a podcast, we're a website, we're many things, but essentially we exist to tell stories of people who are doing the work of healing and regenerating for this time and also for a more hopeful future. And Dumbo Feather is owned by Danny Elmagor and Barry Lieberman, who some of you might know from the impact investment space. Their family office is called Small Giants. And they're deeply involved in SOCAP and have many incredible businesses here that are leading towards next economy businesses and practices. So we have this an hour together with Napoon, and I'm going to introduce Napoon now. He's the founder of Service Space, which is an incubator of gift economy projects that inspires people to be the change they want to see in the world. And we had the privilege of sharing Napoon's story last year in issue 60 of Dumbo Feather. It was actually our anniversary issue. This is the magazine here. Which was such a joy to speak with him for that mag. It's all on belonging, and if you don't have it and you'd like to get your hands on it, it's still available on our website, dumbofeather.com. And you can also look at becoming a subscriber there too and exploring our work. We deliver worldwide. So Napoon has an incredible story of climbing the corporate growth ladder in his 20s before realizing it had no end and pivoting his life's work to come from a place of generosity. His projects have included Karma Kitchen, which is a restaurant chain where the meal you eat is gifted from a previous customer, and Laddership Circles, a transformational program for people to dive into gift economy practices and learn to lead from within. Napoon was honoured an unsung hero of compassion by the Dalai Lama, not long before President Obama appointed him to a council for addressing poverty and inequality in the United States. His role is to bring an abundance mindset back into our communities, where giving might well be the ultimate reward, and where there are many kinds of capital to trade, from love and kindness to attention and time. So Napoon, it's so good to be chatting with you again, probably a year and a bit from when we last spoke. It's been a big week. It's been an enormous year. I guess I just wanted to check in first of all and see how you're doing. Where are you at?
Well, I'm doing great. Thank you, Nathan. It's great to see you as well. Thank you for the kind introduction. And yeah, indeed, I think it's been, I mean, for us in the US, of course, we just had the elections, but I think in the larger context of 2020, I mean, who could have predicted this kind of a year? So it seems like a lot of compounding catastrophes in some sense coming together, and I think inviting us to cultivate our resiliency and not necessarily just double down on systems of singular efficiency, which is what we have created thus far. So yeah, it's an interesting, it's definitely a testing time for so many. And I think also a time of, possibility in terms of what is, when you head down the U, what comes out the other side. And I think that's where we can see how to frame a lot of what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious as to how this year might have shaped the work that you've been doing, what you've been doing with service-based. Have things shifted at all? Has it deepened the commitment to the work?
Oh, well, at some level, it's completely showed us how relevant some of those values were. For those that don't know, service-based is an ecosystem of. We started by building websites for nonprofits back in 1999, when nonprofits didn't even know what websites were. And then we started doing all kinds of other things, doing vertical web portals and then doing so many offline circles. But Nathan, to your point, this is like, you have to pivot. There's no option, because we used to do, even at our own home, right? We used to hold these awaken circles every Wednesday for the last 21 years. And, it's like you sit in silence for an hour, and the second hour is a circle of sharing, and the third hour is a meal together. And, it's just in my home, there's hundreds of these circles now around the world, but even in our home, like all of a sudden, like nothing, as my mom likes to say, this would actually be at my parents' house, but as my mom likes to say, we went from, having 150 people over 1 week to like absolutely nothing. And what does that do for you? And that's at a personal level, but I think even just collectively, when everything starts to go virtual, you start to lose a lot of the data points, right? Like if we were having this conversation in person, there's so much more. It would be such a high bandwidth interaction, even if it's one-on-one, versus now it's just online. And I think what you do is you privilege content over context. You bias towards the content. And in the short term, it's like, oh, that works, it's actually more efficient. It's great. But you're losing a lot of the context. So if you're just looking at a farm and saying, oh, how do we pluck the fruits? For a short period, you can get away with that kind of a conversation. But at some point, you're going to have to tend to the soil. You're going to have to tend to the roots. You're going to have to see how all the different parts of the ecosystem are interacting with each other. And so for us, of course, like everybody, we also had to pivot, and we did. But what was interesting, especially in the context of our conversation today around multiple forms of capital, is that so we were having many conversations with many leaders, and what we saw was that if all your wealth was in one basket, which is, say, primarily for financial capital. So we were talking to like chancellors of major universities and and leaders of these institutions, and their primary concern, this is a little bit earlier in the pandemic, their primary concern was, okay, I need to secure my funding. And everyone's like completely doubling down on that. But when all your capacity is going there, you have very little left to go out and try something new. You could do maybe status quo, keep up with what you were doing, but majority of your effort just has to go into, keeping the ship afloat. And keeping that ship afloat meant really securing a lot of financial capital, which was running dry. And so as a result, there was very little space. Like the innovations didn't come and are not coming from those institutions that were just singularly built on a foundation of, say, financial capital alone. And for us, we were anything but financial capital. So we were heavily in the time capital, right? If you want to think of it as another form of wealth. And that was incredibly fluid. And not only fluid, we're totally moved by intrinsic motivators. So everyone's like, wow, the world's going down. And I mean, that's how I felt. And maybe, who knows? And it's like, what are we going to do? And when you're moved by intrinsic motivators, it actually multiplies. It's regenerative. Right? And so what we saw was just a tremendous multiplication of an exponential increase in people just wanting to help, people wanting to engage, people wanting to see the good. And so mid-March, we actually launched a whole new portal. And we were, because what was happening, this is like mid-March, right? If you can put yourself back in those shoes, pandemic, just kind of early March, we're starting to realize, oh, this is a serious thing. And then there's this, like, oh my God, we're all doomed. And what we decided to do, what we thought was really needed, was to not just like look at how things are going, how bad things are, but also to keep the love element alive, because we were just fear was just multiplying and multiplying. Everyone was going to multiply that, and some of it is helpful, but some of it really a lot of it just keeps you from living altogether. And so we said, well, how do we rebalance the scales? And so by mid-March, we were like, let's create a new portal that highlights the stories of people responding with compassion, not with fear. And this is not to say that, fear doesn't have any use at all, but it is to say that we need to amplify those stories. So, Corona, at that time, coronavirus is what everyone was going. And we were like, let's just call it Karunavirus. Karuna is Sanskrit for compassion. And so it was like, just as you have this contagion effect of the COVID virus, what is a contagion effect of compassion? How do we multiply that? Because people were responding, but there was no narrative around that. And there were no, like, you heard one or two stories. So we created a whole portal, and it has thousands of stories now. But it was, by mid-March, like, we had actually created a full-blown thing just with time capital. And so that kind of a pivot, and we just kept multiplying as we went, but that kind of a pivot, A, was necessary, but B, if you were not just vested in one vertical form of capital, you actually had a greater capacity to turn. And we saw that.
That platform, what is it called? Where can we find those stories?
It's called karunavirus.org.
Okay, great.
As soon as the virus, we're probably going to rebrand it to Corona News at some point or something like that. But right now the virus is still alive, so we're still calling it. We're saying, let's create a virus of compassion, of responding with compassion.
I completely agree with you. Like, this time, there is a very singular orientation, which some people have where creativity has been limited and stifled. And I've seen that in a lot of people, where the fear, as you said, has kind of been perpetuated. But then this time, like, the limited freedom that we've had has also allowed, in some incredible ways, people to expand and do creative things that they might not have done before. And I've seen that even in my local community. There's a bowling club that was completely dead, and a couple of gardeners have started taking over these lawn bowls and creating organic gardens there. But during this period of lockdown, more and more volunteers were coming down. They were starting to actually create food boxes for families in need in our community. And just, that creativity that sparked from this period was incredible. And it suddenly became this, now, 60 to 100 food boxes prepared for families in need every week. And these families have always been in need, but this time has kind of shown us the opportunity.
Absolutely. And we were seeing so many stories of everyday heroes just responding with incredible compassion. It was where, you had, even in the earliest days, we were all quarantined and locked down, like in Italy. You hear people singing from their balconies to say, I'm there, I'm with you in solidarity. I actually happened to be in a 30-day meditation retreat in all of March. Yeah. So imagine that, right? I come out and I'm like, oh, the whole world is quarantined, not just me. And every night at 8 p.m., I would hear everybody howling. And I was like, what's going on? And it was precisely at 8. And it was a tribute to all the frontline workers. So everybody would come out in the neighborhood where my little cabin was. Everybody would come out and say, yeah, we're with you. We're with each other. We belong. We are resilient. We will get through this. That was like, and you hear stories like that guy in Britain, right? Like he 99-year-old guy. I'm sure you've heard this. It's just this guy says, I want to do something for the nurses, and like 99 years old, what's he going to do? Well, for my 100th birthday, I want to walk with my walker 100 laps in my backyard. And I want to raise 1,000 pounds. And it just completely took over the whole country. And they were like, they raised 33 million pounds or something to that order. And it was just like, it was everywhere. These kinds of stories were everywhere. And even little kids saying, hey, I'm going to set up what joke capital, right? If you want to call it that, like laughter capital. I mean, people are too serious. And so there were these kids in Canada that were like, yeah, I'm going to set up what do they, I forget what they call it, but a laughing stand or a joke stand or something like that, where they would just share jokes from a distance with all those who pass by. And it was just like, it was like, yeah, yes, we are in trouble. Yes, we don't know the cause of it. Yes, if we're not careful, it's all going to multiply. But also, it's like a yes, and it's like we're strong. We are resilient. We are together. And
it's been hard to keep coming back to that place. The longer we've been, I think, in lockdown, it gets weary and it gets tough. And I don't want to negate, how much of a challenge it really is on our psyches and our well-beings. It's kind of like we have to pulse, I think, between the expansion and then the contraction, and allow ourselves, when we are feeling that, the heaviness of it, to just kind of sit with it and not feel like we have to be out there doing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it has been incredibly hard. I mean, it's been hard for all of us, right? Like I live in an 800 square foot place with my wife, and you're not going anywhere. And this is like downtown, and there's no nature. You don't have the social kind of contact, and it's just like, you could do it for a month or two. You're like, okay, this is a break. This is however you frame it. And that's in my context. And then you think of all the frontline workers, and then you think of globally, and you say, like, is this the best system we can create? Like, this is where there is suffering, but that suffering is spread completely unequally and unfairly. And so, it just raised so many questions, and I don't think those questions have gone away. But we need to find that place in us of strength, so we can respond and not get overwhelmed. And how do we do that? How do we help each other do that? I mean, I think.
Yeah. I hope it's not too long before your mum's opening her doors again to those beautiful awakened circles. I remember hearing about them last year, and I was so moved.
I just saw her last night, and she's like, I see people in our backyard, and they're elders, and so for them it's even riskier to be engaging with people, so they only meet people outdoors. But she still finds her ways. She's communing a lot more with her plants in her backyard, and making things for other people still, and leaving them on her front porch. So she's finding ways, but yeah, it's just not the same.
Yeah. So I want to unpack some of these forms of wealth that you've been talking about, writing about, speaking about for the past 4 or 5 years. But before we kind of launch into them, I wanted you to give us an idea of this term giftivism, which you talk about a lot, and what the gift economy looks like and what it means to you, just to kind of launch into that conversation.
Yeah. Well, gift economy, there's a lot there, right? So I don't know how I can soundbite it, but I think this idea that we can lead with relationships and not transactions. That transaction is like, I connect with you, you connect with me, and it's a very direct reciprocity model. What can I get from you? What can you get from me? Quid pro quo, tit for tat, that kind of a view. I think for me, it's what happens when you lead with relationships. When it's transactional, we have a very singular sort of view of each other. But when we start to move from transaction to relationships, it becomes much more multidimensional. And when you do that, and when those relationships deepen, you move from direct reciprocity, which is what are we doing? How are we exchanging on a very narrow bandwidth here? I give you money, you give me a sandwich, sort of a transaction, to an indirect reciprocity, where I give to you, you give to the person next to you, that person next to you gives to the person next to them, and because we're in a circle, that person behind me is taking care of me, right? So everyone is still taken care of in the circle, but you're not doing it in a quid pro quo way. And you see this even in the business context, right? Like you see this where if you want efficient teams, productive teams, research shows that if you have givers in your ecology, you're much more likely to, you're going to be a lot more productive. And so how do you, Adam Grant's famous work, he says there's takers who just take, givers who just give, and matchers who are in between. They will take as in they'll put a boundary if you're a taker, and they'll be giving to you if you're a giver. And so in any given ecology, you have a mix of these givers, takers, and matchers. And as you tilt the center of gravity of that ecosystem towards givers, trust goes up at a very basic level. You start to relate to people in a much deeper way. And based on those relationships, you do have higher trust. And with higher trust, you have a lot more synergy, and you have a lot more productivity. So Kellogg has done all this research on how productivity rises when you have a giver ecology. So how do you, I think that's a very relevant question. So for me, it's been, we work in a different scale, not just in a small team like setting, but we're also asking these questions around what does it mean to create a culture that is rooted in greater generosity, that is rooted not just in transaction, but in relationship. In not the singularity of transactions, but in the multidimensionality of relationships, and what then happens in a field of these relationships. What emerges? What is the collective intelligence that arises? What are the different solutions? What are the innovations that arise in that kind of a field? And so, these are questions that I think are relevant to anywhere where you're working with people. I think these are relevant. And so we have been doing it in the field of social change, in the field of voluntary action with a lot of volunteers, in the field of technology as well, designing a lot of technology that is oriented towards intrinsic motivators, that is oriented towards deeper connection. It's not just a quantity of connections, it's also the quality of connections. So Facebook is a solution for if you want the quantity of connections, right? I mean, LinkedIn also. But what happens if you're going for the quality? How would a tech platform be different if you are designing, if the design principle is to create deep ties? At what extent do you stop? I was recently talking about this very famous quote, or it's like a prayer, right? God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now the problem is that as an organizing principle, when you go out and you apply and you say, look, we have all these problems, we have all this suffering in the world, we need a lot of innovations, and now I have this hammer of technology. Now the thing is, at what point do you tell technology that I need to exercise serenity because this is not mine to change? And at what point do you start to be macho and you say, oh, I'm just going to be courageous so that I can change this, and this? And technology is on track right now to just completely, I mean, it is, stocks, the tech stocks have just completely gone off the roof, and they're continuing to, because we're sort of doubling down on that guiding principle. And is that really wise?
Mm.
Like, where do we put a stop to all of that? So to me, these are the questions that very clearly come up after 20 years of doing work in trying to create these examples of indirect reciprocity, of gift economy, of giftivism, different ways to say the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I was reminded the other day by a friend of the kind of essential yogic principle, which is around needing to have balance between the generating force, the organizing force, and the destructive force. And if we look at the world now, I mean, we can see, you know, how much the destructive force, you know, is doubled down and is kind of taking hold. And we look at our own bodies and we can see how that affects us, you know, individually. But then, so in our systems, you know, that destructive force is so apparent. And so, you know, I can see the value of all of us kind of really focusing our energies on that generative force. I think this is a time that we need to really orient towards that work. And then, you know, and if we can see that in technology, you know, I'm always curious about what that looks like in technology and how we can enter quality relationships online. Because for me, it feels like the quality comes from the thing that the magic that happens in person, you know, all of the kind of sensitivity stuff that happens when we're communicating, as you were talking about at the start. I mean, of course, we can still have a rich conversation through these platforms. Maybe it is about the intention with which we come to our conversations, the intention with which we are connecting with each other online. How do we scale that? You know?
And what's the multiplier effect of it? So I think I can bring an intention of connecting very deeply, say through this call. You can bring the same, but what about the architecture of our connection allows for the synergistic effect to be unlocked, right? Where 1 + 1 is greater than 2, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So it's that I have brought this in and you are bringing this in, and it's coming together to create something entirely different. It's like, if you look at, you know, there's so many examples all over nature. Nature is rooted in this kind of synergy. You bring some hydrogen together, you bring some oxygen together. Neither one of the two are liquid. And yet when they come together in a certain formation, you have a whole new property, which is water, which is liquid, which is so useful. And so the question is, how can our architectures of connection support us in this kind of a way? And I think that, you know, again, if financial capital is our only metric, is the only, not even metric, it's the only fuel that is going to, you know, that's going to support the creation of these technologies and these solutions and these innovations, I think it's extremely limited, because money has a very short feedback loop. Money is, you know, geared towards transactions. It's optimized for efficiency and not resiliency. And that is very useful in so many remarkable ways. So that's fantastic. But how do we then juggle that with you know, with alternate possibilities, not even alternate, complementary possibilities? How do we not just double down on in this one direction? And I think that's the question that keeps coming back to me. And I just see that you have the wheels of the markets and the kinds of innovations they crank out are all biased towards appealing to our base instincts, towards appealing to cheap connections, towards appealing to, and then to provide sedatives to compensate for all the different, it's like, yeah, I feel so dissatisfied that I only have, you know, whatever, 5 Facebook friends in a meaningful way. And even that, like on my birthday, you just post something on my wall. And so what you now see is, you know, trust it. I mean, this is true, I don't know worldwide, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was true worldwide. But I just read this data, 18 to 30-year-olds, you know, 73% of them think that, yeah, mostly you just look out for yourself. You know, mostly everybody looks out for themselves. Their trust is just plummeting.
Yeah.
And when we are creating that kind of a context, you know, in 18 to 25-year-olds, I think that's also a number, that 73% like depression in the last decade has gone up 73% in 18 to 25-year-olds from Pew Research. So, how do we compensate for all of that? Where is the field in which we are going to be creating the solutions, and how does the nature of the field, in this case, the nature of the capitals, create, like, what is the through line between the kind of capitals we use and the innovations that we are going to manifest in the world?
It just reminded me of the importance of story capital, right? The stories we are telling ourselves about what it means to be human, the stories we're telling each other. When you're mentioning that nature metaphor, it struck me that for so long I've always thought that when we plant, the roots are going to be competing with each other. We have to be careful about what plants we put next to each other. But my partner is an incredible gardener, and I've just seen that that's not the case at all. Everything is some things will compete a little, but mostly everything is in cooperation. And what story was I being told to think that everything was working on its own? And how has that fed me to think that as a human being, I'm also in this game for my own? So how do we use story capital to move from individualistic lens to the we, and where are we seeing that in the mainstream media? Who are the storytellers that are going to lead us in this direction?
I mean, this is why I love the work that you're doing, Nathan, with Dumbo Feather and all that you stand for. Is so important, because you're, I think one of our volunteers says it really well. She's a remarkable person, who's drafted like constitutions for entire countries, and she says we govern to control vice, but I think we need to now create institutions that amplify virtue. And this is where these stories, if you don't even have that narrative of what's possible, how are you going to, you're just going to think everyone's out to get you, which is what all 18 to 30-year-olds do think now. And even there was this research in the UK, they asked them, how many people do you think are pro-social? Or first they asked people, are you compassionate, kind, pro-social? And again, I think the number was, in this case, I think it was 75%, maybe it's 74. My memory might fail me, but it was like, a big percentage of the people, they're like, yeah, I believe that I should care for other people. And I am like that. And then they asked people, how many of you, what percentage of others do you think are like that? And it was 23%.
Wow. Yeah.
So there's this huge gap. So in actuality, 75% of the people care to be pro-social, connected, compassionate, caring. And they identify themselves as that. But then when you ask them how many of others, and they're like, no, but the rest of the world, that's just 23%, and that's a colossal failure of story. That's a colossal failure of narrative. And even if you look in our teams, in businesses everywhere, right? Like if you just say nice guys finish last, right? Like that's the story, and that's just not true. Like that person has not done serious research. That's like, do you want to be in a team full of takers? And all major companies have realized that doesn't quite work. So how do we turn this in a direction, culturally, institutionally, and even individually? And I think the stories and the narratives we hold is really critical.
So the three forms of capital that you've been advocating a lot are attention capital, time capital, community capital. We've talked quite a bit about community capital. I'd love to unpack attention, actually, and kind of what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I would love to. I was saying how I was in a meditation retreat when the pandemic came, 30 days when you're just like, observing the inner mechanics. And I'm about to go into one next week. For me, it's very critical. And I think it's very humbling when you realize that human beings used to have a 12-second attention span. And there were species below, there were species whose attention span was even less than us. And it turns out that certain kinds of fish have, I think it was like 8.7-second attention span. So they were like, oh, they're the worst. But guess what? We now have overtaken them. And so we now have an 8-second attention span. And we design with that assumption. that, look, I am assuming that you're going to be, I forget, there was this librarian that coined this word. I forget her name, Linda. I'll have to look it up. But she basically said, she coined this word called continuous partial attention. That we are, it's like we've got our headphones on, we're looking at one screen, then we're doing something else, then we got our phones, and we're like constantly. And in between, we have like 30,000 other thoughts, and we're just frantically, and we want to feel like, oh, I stand for something, and I have meaning, and I'm going to make a difference. And then it's like all of a sudden that thought comes, and then by the time you can actually do something meaningful, you're gone. And so what our interns this last summer, we have this internship, and so what our interns were talking about is performative activism, that you're just doing stuff so you can look, you're performing for other people, especially on social media. And they even have a name for that, and so it's just because everything's so, so fluid. So it becomes very complicated to when you have such turbulence on the inside. And how do we start to, and how do we start to be able to focus, be able to look at yourself and say, I'm breathing. And when you do that, again, a lot of people think this is like, okay, great, I'll do that when I'm retired or when I'm stressed out or when I have extra time. But one of my friends, he was working on Wall Street and he was billing every 3 minutes. And it was like, go, 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 go. And all of a sudden, his boss, not all of a sudden, I mean, at the end of the year, his boss comes in and he tells him that we've had a phenomenal year. What would you like? And he says, what I would love is a minute of silence before every team meeting.
Yeah, wow.
And it wasn't just a total. So his boss initially said no. They're like, what a waste of time, doing nothing. Like, what's the point of that? But you're cultivating attention capital. And when you do that, you're tuning into other people. We're talking about moving from transaction to relationship. And if you can't even tune in, if we're 8 seconds and you're like scanning, zoom, 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 or you're constantly like, you don't even know how to listen with that kind of short an attention span. You can say, I'm here and I'm listening. But how deep is that listening? What are you listening to? Are you just listening to make a judgment and then go to the next thing and increase polarity in the world, which is what we're seeing? Or how do we, and so what these guys ended up doing was they found it to be so meaningful, just 60 seconds to land. That 1 minute went to 2 to 3 to 5. And now once a week, they do 30 minutes on Wall Street. And if you ask them that, look, what's the impact of this? Right? Like, what do you get? Like, I mean, I know the impact of your 3 minutes because I get the billable hours, right? What's the impact of this? And they will tell you that it's changed the relationship with each other. It's changed the way in which they do a lot of the things they do. They started to do a 21-day kindness challenge. Doesn't take extra time. Like, so every so often, various companies do this. Like at the end of a meeting, they will all have a deck of cards with the kindness idea on each one. And you go out and do that small act of kindness, right? And when you do that small act, the next check-in at the next meeting is what you have done for other people. And that's just a way to check in, but that's a way to bring something so much deeper about who you are. So when you do that, imagine, Nathan, if you and I were working together, right? Like, and now before every meeting, you're like, not just like saying some random thing or moving on or not paying attention or checking your text or all that. Instead, I arrive, I listen, and I say, hey, what was that small little thing you did for somebody else? What did you go and you took your daughter out and you went to the store and you wrote a little letter of appreciation for the person behind the counter. And they said, oh my God, I have never received anything like this in my life. And the joy and the smile. And then when you share that at our check-in table, like, and then we're going to go and create some technology together, or we're going to, go do some other work together. Clearly that kind of a thing has a huge multiplier effect And I think all of it is rooted in this idea of like, first just being able to just be here and now for more than 8 seconds,
Yeah, when you were talking before about when our attention is kind of moving all over the place, we become quite performative. We hit a very superficial, one-dimensional layer of ourselves in expression of communication. It reminded me that that's also the value of attention capital, is so that we start to re-enter the multiplicity of ourselves. There's so much complexity that we're holding. That attention capital, that being able to spend time with self, helps us to access as many layers, and suddenly we're able to bring the richness of that to our conversations as well, and it's obviously incredibly beneficial for us. So it's about holding the complexity, being able to hold the complexity of the mind as well.
Yeah. I think it's about being able to also then be able to nuance so many of the different, and a lot of the sort of intellectual people are constantly thinking that they do this intellectual nuance, but that's that's one form of nuance. There's so many other forms of nuancing, the experience of life, and a lot of it is non-intellectual or beyond intellectual, beyond even the mind. How do we, and if we don't know how to be still, how to be in the present without an agenda, without wanting to sort of go back and forth in a transactional way, like I think we just don't, we sell ourselves short. We don't have we can't unlock a lot of these capitals that would only get unlocked when we afford ourselves this kind of a landing in the present moment.
And the thing that you've been saying, all this time, Napoleon, is, the reason why we do the inner work, the inner transformation first, the reason why we access these many forms of capital, is so that we can rebuild the systems in a way that we're not just kind of using the same tools. We're not doing it from the same place that we have done. The inner transformation, the inner work comes first, and it's from that place that we are then able to rebuild the systems. It's kind of the reverse of the way that in working. So that's the kind of relationship, right, that you're always teasing out between the inner and the outer.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, our motto in Service Space, right, our tagline is change yourself, change the world. I don't think if you start with change yourself, or rather change the world, change yourself, that's very, very different. Maybe that's possible, but I find that to be a very different approach. You can easily get very distracted and caught up, and then you miss out this incredible gear that you're capable of. The human apparatus is so incredibly intricate and deep and powerful. And yet we are insisting, instead of the 5G connection with life, we are insisting on the dial-up connection, the AOL connection. And we've built all our systems around that. And I'm like, well, why are we doing this to ourselves, And when you go and talk about 5G, people are like, no, that's just like, that's impossible. Where did you read that? In a science fiction novel, I'm like, this is my experience, and you can experience it too. And I think, generosity that's something, the small act of kindness, but it is a entry, is a gateway into that. And I think designing for multiple forms of capital. You talked about stories. I was talking about time, how people can contribute their time. We were talking about attention capital. We're talking about cultivating technologies and using some of that wisdom capital, the courage to, serenity to not touch what is not yours to change, the courage to change what you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And all of that is like, there's a kind of wisdom capital, right? Like, where is a wisdom council at a major tech company? To help you distinguish between the serenity part and the courage part, right? And those kinds of things. I think as a culture, we have to ask those questions individually, and I think institutionally, but I think in Service Space, we've been asking them at a much more meta cultural level as well.
So as Carrie said, if you do have any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll just continue with our conversation. I'm loving this. So I wanted to ask about, oh, actually, do you have the slide just so we can quickly run through it with the different forms of capital and their value and the currency? Just
I don't know. I can
otherwise,
look
it's
that
on
up.
your website. It's really great and useful, I find.
Yeah. Wait, so while you tell us a little bit about your experience with multiple forms of capital. I mean, you're running an organization in Australia, and you've got a lot going on. How have you related to this idea of multiple forms of capital? While I look up that slide you're talking
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I'm looking after the storytelling part of the Small Giants Academy work and Dumbo Feather work. So I am very invested in story capital, and that's kind of why I brought that up. I think a lot about the capital of culture as well. And, you know, it's very related to story. What is the culture that we are creating that is going to move us in a different orientation, move us from the place of individualism to the place of the we. So I feel very strongly about the culture and the relationship between, you know, individual consciousness, the stories we are telling, and then the culture that we create. So I see a lot of value in that. I'm always thinking about time capital and how I can use my time more effectively for the world, to be of service to the world. And, you know, recently I've really had that shift of understanding, you know, we were talking before about generosity and the flow that comes from giving, and the kind of the giving back that comes when we are giving forward. And I really want to kind of hone in on that, because I think there's reminding ourselves of that feeling helps us to keep perpetuating and to keep feeling of service and being of service to the world. So yeah, I want to keep orienting in that direction, but it's so hard to, you know, it's so easy to fall off.
I mean, do you feel that it's easy for like for the community around you to embrace this idea?
I mean, it's been really wonderful to see this community kind of grow and to, you know, really engage with, as I said, that garden. And then this time has meant that more of us are out, more of us are getting to know each other. And as soon as you start to know your neighbours, you know, you feel that community support. It doesn't really feel like the feeling of just doing this on your own starts to feel a bit ugly and yuck, you know. So why wouldn't I want to orient out towards the window, you know, because people are there, people are willing to receive me, people are willing to give, people want to receive, you know, vegetables from the garden or preserves that we're making, whatever it is. And, you know, there's just such a more centering state from those connections, from the community capital that comes. We sleep better. There's a greater sense of well-being that I know to be true.
It's here. I just have this is just the chart of some of the capitals that we haven't talked about, but I think thinking in terms of capital, I couldn't find the slides. I need to do a deeper search here, but you know, I think you can look at each capital and you can say, well, what are the different, and we do this for money so effectively. And I think it's a matter of us asking questions around other capitals and doing that. Like, what is a currency, right? If let's take compassion. We were talking about compassion, Karuna earlier, right? If compassion is a capital, maybe Kindax is your currency. What does that look like at scale? And then what is the benefit to society? And so, you know, you can look at technology and you can say that's the currency I have, and you know, what are the systems and the effectiveness? Nature, you're gardening, you're talking about that, you know, organisms could be a kind of currency at scale. It creates an ecosystem, and the biodiversity is the unique sort of value add that starts to emerge. So you can start to do this across the board, and you say, where are the currencies? You know, you have markets where you can trade. Money is so liquid. Money can, you know, start to flow. And where are the markets for all this other stuff? What's the currency? You know, and maybe some of this stuff is beyond currency. Maybe some of this stuff isn't, but maybe some of it actually could benefit from it, you know. So I also like this kind of graphic somehow. I don't know why it doesn't say much, but I like it. It says, how do we build a bigger pie? And for me, I think that's a big, huge question to ask ourselves, that Like, we are working with extrinsic motivators, money, power, and fame, and that has some, that has some value, and it gets us to a certain point. And then we're all fighting about for that one pie. And now the question is, how do you build a bigger pie? So in service space, right? Like, we are working with just time capital. And most of the times, from the lens of that small piece, you're like, no, it's impossible. Everything's got to be here, framed in my little small kind of capital. But we discovered that, there's not only millions of people that want to contribute, but that's a completely underutilized resource. So yes, it's not easy to just, make meaningful use of it. But we're tackling problems like, old age, and we're talking about technology sector. I live in the Silicon Valley, I grew up in the Silicon Valley. And so here you have these guys, they're saying, look, death is a disease, and we just need greater innovations to solve death. Like, this is on the cover of all the magazines. Like, and we're asking those questions, and those questions somehow seem okay. To me, they're a little troubling in general, but like, can we use that creativity and enthusiasm to solve really hard questions, and to say, like, what does it mean to why are we not able to? Everyone knows there's millions of people that want to contribute their gifts, their talents, their stories, and everyone who has done this work, even in the slightest, will tell you that is a completely underutilized pot. And so why is that? Why aren't we able to solve that? Why don't we put more of our human collective energy into addressing these kinds of issues? So
I love it. So we've got a question from Alex Todd. He's asking, how can the various types of capital be used as a currency for exchanging value? Are there mechanisms, tools, or technologies that facilitate the accumulation and exchange? Are there mechanisms, tools, or technologies that facilitate the accumulation and exchange of these types of capital?
So can you just rephrase that for me real quick here?
Yeah, I'm just going to try and it is what you were speaking to in the graph. How can the
mechanisms, tools that facilitate are there? You mean are there tools that facilitate? Oh, the accumulation and exchange. I mean, I think part of the problem is that we have many mechanisms that encourage accumulation and not circulation, and not flow. And so, yes, we have mechanisms, but those mechanisms itself tend to be biased in a certain direction. And so how do we create new mechanisms that encourage, maybe by accumulation, I don't think you mean like, becoming a billionaire in time capital, but I think what you're talking about, I'm guessing, Alex, is you're saying that, how do you create a store of value? Money is very good store of value. So how do you create a store of value so you have something and that you can then flow in a meaningful way? So yeah, I think there are many forms of capitals. I think we can leverage technology, current technologies, to create platforms for that. Service space has been doing that with millions of hours of time capital in a very clear way. I have been doing that to cultivate my own attention capital, because I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that I sit down and I watch my breath, and just a couple of minutes later it's like gone into its own thing, and I'm like, wait a second, I didn't tell you to go. And if under the hood, like, you can't even be with your breath for 5 minutes, what are you going to do outside? You're probably just going to vomit a lot of that turbulence outside and create up problems for other people. So yeah, I think we owe it to ourselves to ask this question. I don't have the answers per se, but I think this is a very important question, and I think it can be a good good sort of jumping board to say that, if you're running a team, or if you're even if you're working with a small group of people on a short-term basis, you say, how can I move this to a higher bandwidth connection? And invariably, that's going to require you to honor and incorporate multiple forms of capital in that engagement. And when you do that, you know, you create a whole different field of synergy. So yes, there are many expressions of capital. Yes, we should be asking that question. We have some platforms that can facilitate this kind of exchange, but I think in a very deep way, we just need to create new platforms because there's a very low ceiling to, if you use extrinsic motivators to create a platform that multiply intrinsic motivators, there's an inherent paradox there. So that means that it's just going to have a very low ceiling. So I think we need to create like some of these solutions with you know, ecosystems that are engaged in different kinds of wealth, different kinds of currencies.
And I love the question you always put forward when people kind of ask, where do I start? You know, your question is, well, what form of wealth capital do you want to amplify? What is the one that you most resonates with you? And then you go out and you start to kind of perpetuate that. So it's the starting point is just to feel that resonance. For question from Carrie, she says, connecting this to shifting to a new form of capitalism, what practices would you suggest to people just starting to think about these forms of capital? Do you have resources for getting started?
Yeah, well, there's many people trying many different things. So I would say expose yourself to different ideas. I would say ask different questions, like what Adam Grant invites us to do. Are you in a give or take ecology, or you know, is your team largely taker ecosystem, or a matcher ecosystem, or a giver ecosystem? I think asking those kinds of questions it takes you down a very different track. I think incorporating, you know, there's so many examples. We help. I give you this example because this was amazing. I know we're running out of time, but this was an amazing thing. So we have so many examples of people that are doing different experiments. So one monk said, he came out with a CD and he says, I will accept kindness capital as a part of you know, so as a part of payment for the CD. So if you do an act of kindness and you tell me the story, I'll accept it. We hosted a whole conference where you had tickets. This was at Berkeley's Zellerbach Hall, right? So it was like big hall, famous place, and all kinds of people were there. And we said, look, you can buy a ticket with money, but you can also, we also accept not just Visa and MasterCard, right? We also accept kindness and creativity and time and attention capital, which meant that if you do 5 acts of kindness and you tell us the stories, we will accept that. We will honor that. If you go out and volunteer for a nonprofit in the community and you know, share with us what you did, we will accept that. If you make a selfie, a 4-minute selfie about the video, rather a video selfie about the theme of the conference, and tell us why that's meaningful to you, we will accept that. If you spend 8 hours in meditation and write a reflection, we will accept that as a currency. And so here you had 800 people, but 300 of them were with alternate forms of wealth. And what happens in that kind of a space? I mean, it was amazing. The kind of videos we got, we were like, this is so powerful. We can't just accept it as like a ticket price. We have to bring these people on stage. We have to show this video to everybody. And now imagine you didn't even pay financial currency for this. And now you're like, you know, you are being represented on the screen. Like, how is that engagement going to drive your interactions in the off hours? Right? It's just going to be remarkable. And so, and we saw this in this alive ecosystem over a 2-day conference at Zellerbach at UC Berkeley. And so these kinds of things are possible, right? And so I think we need to experiment. So I think the greatest resource is our hearts. And I think we just need to tap into that. We need to honor people for more than just a singular gift that they bring. And I think we need to go even beyond people individually and just look at the whole as being greater than the sum of the parts. And I think asking those questions is probably at this point in our culture, that's probably the greatest thing we can do. And I'm here if you want to, do that with me. I know Nathan's here. I know Nathan and I are doing that together, as well. And I think that's what makes it stronger. So I think if we can circulate this kind of wealth, I don't know what kind of wealth this is, but this kind of a possibility, I think we'll all be better off.
Yes. Thank you, Napoleon. Thank you so much for sharing all of that goodness. So if people want to find out more about your work, connect with you, the best space to do that is which website? You've got many.
Which one? Yeah, you could go to surfacespace.org. There's one site. And that'll, you can subscribe to like one of our, I don't know, we probably have like 50 newsletters that you can subscribe to. But yeah, thank you for holding this.
Pleasure. And dumbofeather.com for us. We're at Small Giants Academy as well, smallgiants.com.au. Next year, we are launching a Mastery of Business and Empathy, which is super exciting. You can register interest, find out more about that on our Small Giants website. Thank you to SOCAP for hosting us, and thanks for being part of this. See you soon.
I'm still on mute.